Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, January 27th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about Penn State hiring Jim Knowles, a lot of different things going into this 2025 season for Penn State, and they just pushed their chips to the center of the table as far as I'm concerned. So we'll get into that. We'll get into a couple of names to watch for the Ohio State defensive coordinator search, and kind of just get into the big year that 2025 is for Penn State. Then we'll talk about the tampering allegations around Ohio State. Sounds like Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith were offered a pretty penny to find their way elsewhere out of Ohio State, and we'll talk about that and how it's a huge issue in college sports and how, as of right now, we don't really have anyone to fix that issue as of at least right now. Then we'll get to a little bit of an early look in the NFL draft. We'll do a little bit of a deeper look on Wednesday, but wanted to give you guys kind of a 50,000 feet look at all the different prospects, quarterback, offensive players, defensive players, and obviously a draft order to start things off. And then we'll get to the teams with the most to prove in 2025. A lot of different teams, including that one we'll talk about in the first segment. And then we'll finish it off. We'll talk about the transfer portal winners and losers from the winter cycle. A lot of different winners. Some losers, definitely, but definitely some people that have kind of negated their losing just a little bit, but we'll get into that obviously in time. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can click that $sign, add any question, comment you like, it'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have fun back and forth. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, because Jim Knowles has been hired at Penn State, and it kind of sends a message to just about everyone in college football, especially the Penn State fans, that they're all in on 2025. Plain and simple. That is what's going to happen in 2025, and it's going to create a lot of energy around that program and a lot of pressure around that program. So let's go ahead and jump into this, and the details of this are relatively simple. It sounds like Jim Knowles is getting paid $3.1 million per year to be the new defensive coordinator at Penn State, a number that a lot of Penn State fans wouldn't even dream they'd be paying for a coordinator about 3 years ago. So that is a big thing that we need to talk about a little bit more. Oklahoma felt like they had this one. There were a lot of people around the Oklahoma world that were saying he's pretty much locked up his defensive coordinator job. He is pretty much our new defensive coordinator. And then Penn State came swooping in. So a lot of different things to kind of unpack here. And one of the bigger ones is just, why would he leave Ohio State? Why would he walk out of the team that just won a national title, that he just led with the number one defense in the country? The short answer, it seems like there was a rift between him and some of the staff. Now, the details are relatively unknown, but sounds like there wasn't necessarily the best relationship between Jim Knowles and the rest of the Ohio State staff, and they did great things without it. So not necessarily taking anything away from the product on the field, but definitely something to think about, and probably encourage Jim Knowles to go find the best offer outside of Columbus and go take that. So I do think Ohio State actually matched that offer of $3.1 million, so it wasn't necessarily a money thing. A lot of people are bringing up that he's from Philadelphia, 3 miles away from State College. I'm not necessarily going to put a ton of credence in that, but I do think there was a little bit of, maybe it just wasn't the best place for him. Maybe it just wasn't the best D coordinator for Ohio State down the road. So definitely something that was very interesting and a little bit surprising. People called it a lateral move. People called it a downgrade. I think that's up for debate, if I'm being totally honest with you. I understand Ohio State's on the top of the sport, so obviously Penn State's a little bit of a downgrade, as would any job be right now, but overall I think it's one of those things that it probably makes sense for both sides. It's not ideal for Ohio State by any means. They're going to have to go find a new defensive coordinator, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but overall it's one of those things that I think it probably worked out the way that Jim Knowles knew it was going to work out at the end of the year. I don't think anyone over there is overly surprised that he finally took this job, so one of those things that will be interesting to watch, what Ohio State does from going forward. But he coached one of the best defenses in the country, or the best defense in the country this past year. So it would be really, really interesting to watch what happened here. And definitely would be one of those things that we're going to have to see what he's going to be able to do. I think he's going to be absolutely incredible at Penn State, but there is a couple of questions around this, and definitely some things that, especially with the relationships he had at Ohio State, maybe it becomes a little bit of a problem at Penn State, but definitely something we can unpack with a little bit more time. That's a good question. I don't know. I think I would lean great developer of talent, just because I think you have so much more ability now to add different recruiters and add different people to that staff, that I'd probably have the guy that I'd rather develop the people in-house and then say, okay, you can be a part of the recruiting visits, but be able to have, all those people around you that can do the recruiting pitch, maybe just a little bit better than the other person can, but I think I lean developer of talent, but it's very, very close. When you talk about college football, 90% of the battle is getting the talent on the field that you need. So it's definitely one of those things you could go back and forth on, and I think it's a toss-up if I'm being totally honest. But overall, I think I'd lean developer over recruiter, but very, very close. James Franklin has it. He officially has the team that can put him over the top, that can get him the couple of wins that he has not gotten in the past years. He might have the very best coaching staff in the country. I think Texas might have him edged out just a little bit, but very, very close between those two. And I think you look at the roster, about as good as you're going to find across the country. Now, I do worry about the depth just a little bit with this team, but the top line talent is as good as you're going to find across the country. And now they have the coach to go along with it. Now they have the coordinators to go along with it, with him and Andy Kotelnicki. It's going to be awesome to watch what happens with this one. It's definitely going to be interesting to see what Penn State can do, and we'll jump into that here in a second, but definitely wanted to get into what Ohio State is going to do going forward. What are they going to look like, and what that defensive coordinator job is going to look like going forward. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Before we do it, I want to answer this question from Anthony, but yeah, I definitely think that's a reality. I think there's a couple of different guys around. Let's go ahead and jump into that. And a couple of different guys that popped into my head that I've seen around, and definitely some names that I think are really interesting. We'll start with Phil Parker. This would kind of be a Jim Knowles type hire. This would be a super experienced, super good coach that is a little bit more of a developer than a recruiter, kind of like Jim Knowles was. So you're in a position where you're going to play really disciplined defense. You're going to play probably up to, or at least maybe even over your talent level with Phil Parker as your DC. I think that's a name to watch. I don't necessarily think he's going to leave, but I think for the right number, it could get very interesting very quickly. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and I do think there's certain things that probably will get in the way of this one, if I'm being totally honest, but I do think the right number, and if they were all in on this guy, might be hard to pass up. Then you have Chris Hampton over at Oregon. This one would be a little bit more fun, a little bit different. Definitely would steal a guy from Oregon that they very much like at the safety coach and co-defensive coordinator position, and he's a guy that I think is going to be a head coach pretty soon. So that's the other thing you have to think about is, do you want a guy that's going to be there for 5-10 years, or do you want a guy that's going to be there for 2 or 3 years and then find a head coaching job? That's probably the guy you're getting in Chris Hampton one way or the other. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. And then you have the name that was brought up yesterday. That was Matt Guerrieri. He is a guy that coaches safeties for them, done an incredible job with Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs this year. And you got a pretty specific shout out from Ryan Day during their parade yesterday. So I don't know if that's just, preempting the move that is going to happen, or they're going to go a totally different direction, but very talented guy. There's no doubt about that, and absolutely someone that could take over those reins. There's always the question of, he hasn't been a DC yet. Is he ready to be a DC at Ohio State? But at the end of the day, if Ryan Day trusts him, I'm more than happy to trust him as well. And then some other names are Brian Haynes. He just signed an extension at Indiana. Don't expect that to happen. So that's definitely one to keep your eye out on at least. Jeff Hafley, he left college football because of the changes. I don't think he's coming back to college football. And then Glenn Schumann was one that was brought up. I don't think he's likely to leave Georgia as of right now. So I lean towards those first three, and then a couple other names that are out there that are definitely guys to watch. There's a linebacker coach up in Green Bay with Jeff Hafley that's someone to watch. So there's definitely going to be some different names. James Laurinaitis has been brought up, so it'll be really interesting to figure out what's going to happen here. And I think when you look at what they could do, they could go Anthony's route and try to get, one of the defensive coordinators from one of the defensive coordinators from a smaller school in the Big Ten. The Luke Fickell one's an interesting one, because you're looking down to 2025 for Wisconsin, where if he doesn't execute, do they give him another year? Do they fire him? And what does Ohio State do at that defensive coordinator position in the meantime? I don't think he's necessarily leaving his post right about now, but definitely something to watch down the road, where maybe they hire Matt Guerrieri and doesn't quite go the way they want it to, and then they get a chance at Luke Fickell in a couple of years here. So that's something to watch. There's no doubt about that. I'd be a little bit surprised if that unfolded this time around, but I do think there's some names out there, whether they're big or not, that could be huge additions to this team. But let's get back to the Penn State side of things. We talked about Ohio State plenty. Let's get back to Penn State, and let's talk about the returners they have on defense, because this is what Jim Knowles is working with as of right now. You have Dennis Sutton. Cannot be overstated how huge that guy is going into 2025. He needs to be the leader of this defense, and he needs to be the guy that, I don't think he has to do Abdul Carter level stuff. He's got to be pretty close. He's got to be an absolute game wrecker for them and really open things up for the entire back end, which is a little bit more convoluted when you talk about how Jim Knowles likes to go about business. definitely need a little bit more from that back end. So the front line, you got to get there with 4, one way or another. Dennis Sutton's going to lead that way, and then Zane Durant's a huge piece to get back on the interior of that defense, maybe the biggest piece of this group, if I'm being totally honest. He's going to give a lot of structure to that team and definitely lock them in a little bit better. You got Dom DeLuca at linebacker, you got Tony Rojas at linebacker, along with Alonzo Ford, who's playing some really good football there. You got some really good guys in the middle of this defense. And then on the back end, Zion Tracy, Zakee Wheatley, A.J. Harris, you're going to be more than fine. You have these talent. You have the foundation to make sure that this thing can be built right, and you can have a top 5 defense in the country. You can have a top 5 defender in the country and Dennis Sutton. You can have Tony Rojas being an absolute monster, maybe like a butt kiss award winner next year. And then Zion Tracy and Zakee Wheatley give you so many options on the back end. They're so good at making sure that they give a nice structure to this group and keep everyone in line. And that is a huge part of this defense, is having 2 safeties that you can very much trust. They had them in Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom. Probably taking a little bit of a step down when you come to talent, but overall, 2 very, very talented, 2 very experienced guys that well, I think will help this learning curve that is going to be a thing for this Jim Knowles defense. I think it's going to help it come along a little bit quicker than before. But we've talked about Jim Knowles. We've talked about all the things that are happening around Penn State. What are the certain things that have to happen in 2025 that have to go right, or they're going to fall off a cliff, or it's not going to end the way they want it to, which is winning a national title at this point? So let's go ahead and jump into this. And I think the wide receiver play is the biggest part, right? It needs to elevate next year. There's no 2 ways around this. There's no way to kind of find your way tiptoeing around this. You're not going to win a national title if they don't make plays on the outside, plain and simple, especially without Tyler Warren in your lineup. So this is something that you're no longer at the point where you can say, well, there's next year and we'll figure it out. It's going to be really tough to figure it out next year, especially with all of the pressure that's on this year. So Kyron Hudson, Devontae Ross, you brought in. That's a 4th receiver from USC, and that's a G5 talent. Now, both those guys are very talented. I think both can be very effective, especially Dante Ross, but I do think there's got to be some confidence there, and there's got to be a moment during the spring where they turn their head and they say, we got our 2 guys. If they don't say that, then they're probably scrambling during spring, and this has not necessarily been fixed to the level that you need it to going into next year. Drew Aller needs to take that next step. You know, we thought it was going to be this year, and he did take a step this year. It's not necessarily to say that he played terrible football throughout the year. He played better football than he did the first time around. He's going to have to elevate a little bit more. He's going to have to be the quarterback that can lead them to a national title, do a Will Howard type run in that CFP 4 games where he is the main focus, he is the main attention, he's making every single play in front of him. That is a very difficult thing for a kid that we haven't necessarily seen show up in 1 big game in a row. So that's going to be something to battle and definitely something to figure out. He gets Oregon at home, he gets at Ohio State, and then he gets possibly the Big Ten title. You're going to have to win a lot of those games. It can't just be, oh, we beat Ohio State, but we lost in the first round of the CFP. Good for us. That can't be the way that this season goes for Penn State, especially with all that's being invested. So definitely going to be something to watch. And then finally, quick learning of the Jim Knowles defense, is going to be a real thing here. You know, they have a ton of talent on that team, and I think they have the talent that probably better fits what Ohio State had initially. Probably didn't fit what Jim Knowles did from the start, and then they kind of find their stride throughout year and a half when they really started to become one of the elite defenses in the country. You can't have that in 2025. You can't have the learning curve of a year to figure out this defense. It's got to be hitting the ground running, and you have the guys around it that I think are going to be more than fine to be able to do this, but I do think there are moments where you're just going to have to make sure that they're in line, because if they're not, then you're going to meet Ohio State and your defense isn't going to be ready, and Julian Sain's going to put up 400 yards on his old DC. So you're going to have to figure that out. Definitely something to think about, and overall, I think you look at Penn State, you're in the driver's seat of the Big Ten, of the of really the national title chances going into next year. You maybe have the best coaching staff in the country. You have some of the best talent in the country. It's officially time to deliver, and that's something that a lot of Penn State fans love. I think James Franklin loves as well, but probably a little bit nervous about it. It's going to be one of those years where you have to find a way. You have to find a way to win 10 games. You have to find a way to get to the Big Ten championship, to get to the CFP, and then win a couple of games while you're there. I don't necessarily want to say title or bust for Penn State, because it's been a while since they've been able to get to that mountaintop. Ohio State was a little bit different, but I do think it's one of those things where you got to show real concrete strides and pretty big strides in 2025 if anyone's going to have confidence in James Franklin going forward. That's going to be a really big battle. And Anthony, it's Amin Vanover. Amin Vanover is going to be the opposite edge rusher across from Dennis Sutton. Two very, very talented guys. I love Vanover going into next year. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. I think Luke Reynolds is downright special, and I think he's going to be plenty for this team. I don't necessarily know if he's going to be the blocker that Tyler Warren is. I don't know if he's going to be lining up under center or anything like that, but he absolutely will be a big piece of this offense. They're probably going to need a little bit more from their wide receivers next year, if I had to imagine, though. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. We all understand where Penn State stands right now. They might be the number one team in the country going into next year. They might be the team that everyone expects to win the national title. It's not a place that they've been very often. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this team go throughout spring and go throughout summer and then finally to fall camp. It's going to be fascinating to watch this team and see if they're rising to the moment or they shrink away pretty quickly. But that'll be awesome to watch. We'll obviously keep you updated. But tampering allegations over at Ohio State is something we got to talk about. Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith were offered a pretty penny to find their way out of Columbus and to somewhere else. And we'll talk about what's going on there right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Penn State. They hired Jim Knowles. They have pushed their chips to the center of the table for 2025, and with that comes a lot of pressure. And we'll talk about that obviously in more detail throughout this week, but definitely some things you're going to want to watch very closely around Penn State really throughout the rest of the season. You know, them and Texas are probably going to be the two most talked about teams, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens in 2025 with those two. But let's get to some tampering rumors, and you hate to talk about it, but it's probably something that we got to get into. So, the long story short, essentially, it sounds like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate were offered a lot of money to find their way out of Columbus, Ohio, and find their way to a new school. The school is unknown. It will always be unknown. No one's going to say this school tampered with me because they understand that it would come right back to the team that they're on. So that's not going to happen. Just plain and simple, we will likely never figure out which teams these are. Now, there were some rumors around Texas. There were some rumors around Oregon. Those are always going to be the teams that have rumors around them when elite wide receivers find their way into the portal or allegedly finding their way into the portal. So it could be the case. I wouldn't be necessarily overly surprised if that was the case, but I'm also not going to say absolutely that was the case. So Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, incredible players. Elite athletes. I think they're going to be fantastic at Ohio State next year, maybe even a little bit better than what they had with Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith this year. But Jeremiah Smith was reportedly offered $4.5 million. Carnell Tate was reportedly offered $1 million from an unknown school to leave Ohio State. We won't know who that team is, but regardless, it seems like they were tampering, plain and simple, and it's something that we talk about one way or the other, and there's a couple of things happening here. There's a couple of different things that kind of play into this and kind of make this a reality, and some of it is real, some of it is not so real, some of it helps people, some of it doesn't help anyone, but a couple of very specific people, so we'll get into that here in a second, but overall, I think when you talk about everything that's happening around college football, these are two elite wide receivers. These are two guys that are making every type of play and absolutely are guys that a lot of people are going to want on their roster. The reality is, these are two guys that were in between a national title and a championship parade, and they were getting calls for millions of dollars. They were having to figure out their future. They were having to talk to their family. They were having to do a million things but enjoying the accomplishment that they just did. And I don't understand it. It's something that has to change kind of across the sport, that we don't allow these kids to enjoy what they just did and then be able to enjoy things afterwards because of all the craziness around them. Even a couple of Ohio State players and Notre Dame players dropped out of the Senior Bowl this past weekend because the season's too long. They can't play football right after that. That is another issue here, and it's definitely something that we have to figure out. So you're putting these kids in a really, really bad situation. But overall, what's happening here is a big-time question for a lot of people, because a lot of people are confused by these reports, by what's happening, and by just the structure behind the scenes of what tampering is. And it's hard to pin down in a lot of different respects. It's hard to figure out the exact way it's happening, the way people are going about it. All of the different intricacies are not an easy thing to figure out. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about the biggest one, or maybe not the biggest one, but agents lying about the price is a very real thing in this sport. They do this in pretty much every sport, but college football, it's kind of become a relatively new phenomenon with NIL. Is these kids have agents, and some of them have quote-unquote agents. There's a difference between those two, and it's very, very clear when you hear one of those guys talk. But at the end of the day, it's one of those worlds that we're very, very new to. And it's one of those worlds that every agent across the country has been just waiting and waiting for this to unfold. And then they jumped to and made sure that they locked up a lot of 18-year-olds that don't really know much better about the way that they should be represented, about the money that they should be getting, and mainly about the money that they're giving to their agent. You know, there's a lot of different stories about agents charging 20% agent fees. I'm telling you right now, I don't know much about this business. I know for a fact that if you're getting charged 20% agent fee, you are being robbed. Plain and simple. Any agent that admits to doing that, which is something that someone did here pretty recently, they deserve to not be in this business anymore. Plain and simple. You know, you're in the business of, yes, you know, you got a job to do. You got money to make. I'm not arguing that. You also got to do right by your clients. And it sounds like a lot of people in this business are not. And it leads to something like this, where I'm not necessarily saying this absolutely happened in this case, but it has happened before, where you have a quarterback or you have a big-time running back in the portal, and it comes out one day that so-and-so is offering him $1.2 million. And then you hear that he signed for 1.5 somewhere else. That 1.2 was probably 800,000. You know, that 1.5 down the road was only there because of the 1.2 that was reported. So this is just the reality of sports in a lot of respects. You know, these agents have different lines to some insiders that can release certain information for them to make their client look a little bit more interesting, to make a little bit more grandiose in a lot of respects. And it's something that you kind of battle back and forth on. It's not going to be an easy fix one way or the other, but it is something that has to be figured out. Not necessarily this whole agents lying to reporters, because most teams will be able to take that with a grain of salt going forward. But I do think it's a problem that we have certain people in this sport that just aren't agents. They're not. They call themselves agents, but they are not remotely qualified to be agents. They're not remotely even licensed to be agents in a lot of respects. And now you look up at a system that is entirely broken and run by the wrong people, and then you just add in agents that have nothing to do but make the money that they can. It creates a really, really bad situation for these kids, and definitely puts them in a position where they're making decisions that they don't even know the decision that they're making. And that actually brings me to the next part of this. This is the system being broken, just plain and simple. This is the system being broken. It's the reality where we can get mad at schools for tampering, as if everyone doesn't participate. And we can get mad at the kids, even though they're making decisions that I think a lot of us would make in their similar shoes. But the reality is, we got to blame the people up top. We got to blame the people that are actually setting this thing up, that actually have the power to change a lot of the things in the respect, whether it's change the need for, or change the requirements for agents to get into the business, whether it's change the way that we do the transfer portal, the way we do NIL, whatever it is. There are certain people up top, including Charlie Baker and a lot of people over at the NCAA, that have set this up as a player rights movement, and you've given the player a lot of power. You have not given the system to yield that power effectively, to yield that power smartly, and that's what you should be doing at all times. That should never not be the goal in college football, is to make sure you get the most money out of these guys. That's not the goal. The goal is always to make sure these guys are making the best, most confident, most smart decisions for their future as we move forward. We're putting them in a really bad spot to do that. We're making sure that every single coach can call them whenever they want. And you have a million guys thinking about a million different things when they should be thinking about the national title that they just won. And all of it comes back to the NCAA. You know, it's no disrespect to the NCAA, because some of this is over their head, if I'm being totally honest. Some of this is just above their pay grade at this point. But at the end of the day, I think you look at what is happening around the sport and coaches not knowing what the rules are and acting accordingly by not knowing what the rules are, as are the players. We have to find a way forward, and it has to be essentially outside of the NCAA. I don't think there's any way you go forward with the NCAA and figure all this stuff out. So that's going to be the next iteration of this thing, and you just got to hope that the right people step up at the right moments. And that's something we'll talk about later in the week, probably get into a little bit of detail of how I would run college football and stuff tomorrow, so definitely be on the lookout for that. But the system is broken, and teams are taking advantage of a broken system, and I can't necessarily fault them for that too much. So that's going to be something definitely to watch. But the other part of this was a comment that Ryan Day made earlier in the week, and it was something that frustrated me just a little bit, and not probably for the reasons that a lot of y'all are thinking, but I think this is the quote right here, is I think one of the biggest issues across college football right now is enforcement, is what he said. He said on the Dan Patrick Show, and everyone lost their mind. Everyone collectively came out and said, well, you tampered just as much in the past cycle, so how can you be crying about people tampering for your guys? You know, how can you go after certain coaches and certain schools for doing the exact same thing that you did? First, that is not how those recruitments went down. If you listen to the recruitments of any of the guys that they got in this past year, and we'll get into that here in a second, but if you were around those recruitments by any means, you understand that's not how it went down. Second, even if he did, let's just say he did. Let's say he was talking to these guys in the middle of a game. He was texting them on the sideline while they were playing Auburn to get Caleb Downs, which he wasn't. Let's just say he was, just for fun. He's not wrong. It doesn't make him wrong, and it doesn't make any of the coaches that speak out about this wrong. It just means they're saying what everyone else needs to be saying. And Ryan Day, being a head coach that just won the national title, kind of his obligation to say a lot of this thing. You know, we saw it with Kirby Smart a couple of years ago where he said, this game is really going in a bad path. Right after he won a national title, he didn't take the chance to take a victory lap, to call out his haters, to do any of that stuff. He decided to make sure that the sport was in a better place going forward. That's exactly what Ryan Day is trying to do here. And I understand the frustration. Ohio State did a lot in the portal and did a lot of great things, but the reality of those situations are very different than what I've seen online, and we'll go into this really quickly. Will Howard, he was pushed out of Kansas State, plain and simple. They wanted Avery Johnson to start. They said, you're better off going to find somewhere else to play. He did. He went over to Ohio State. That's a very good pickup. Nothing really crazy there. Happens all the time. Caleb Downs, his coach retired. He was not going to leave Alabama. If Nick Saban was the head coach this year, he would have been in Crimson this year. So that's the reality of that situation. OSU finished second in his high school recruiting, and he was going to find his way to Ohio State. Now, if you were to ask me, I think Ohio State might have stolen him from Georgia more than they stole him from Alabama, if I'm being totally honest. That was the team that I thought he was going to end up at, and then Ohio State swoops in and gets him. And then you have Seth McLaughlin. Ran out of town, plus his coach retired. So he was not going to stick around. The fans did not want him to stick around. And with Parker Brailsford coming in, kind of worked out for both parties in a lot of respects. And then Quinshon Judkins, in a lot of respects, he was run out of town. In a lot of respects, there were a lot of fans saying he's a locker room cancer, saying he can't handle this, saying he's not the guy that you want around your program. And it's going to push people's buttons. That's just the reality of that situation. Quinshon Judkins is a very, very good football player. You keep telling him that he's not a good football player and he's a bad teammate, he's going to find his way out of town, one way or the other. And then he came in to be a combo guy. He didn't come in to be the immediate guy for Ohio State. He came in and they asked TreVeyon Henderson, and TreVeyon Henderson actually had veto power over this addition. He wanted him there. And that's a thing that I think a lot of people are just purposely overlooking, if I'm being totally honest, when we talk about this portal class. Is Ohio State did a lot of the things right. Now, there was the incident with Caleb Downs, but the reality was it was just Caleb Downs posted on his story that he was in the portal. The paperwork hadn't processed yet. That's plain and simple it, and frankly, I would break my finger trying to call Caleb Downs immediately when I found out he was in the portal, no matter how I found it out. So this is something that, obviously, we can talk about more, and we'll probably get into a couple of different things, talking about this tampering world and try to figure out some of the different solutions down the road, probably tomorrow when we get into that in a little bit more detail. But overall, the sport's in a bad place. I don't think that needs to be said to anyone right about now. I don't think anyone needs to disagree with that. I don't think anyone would. But at the end of the day, we are in a place where there are so many great things that can happen over the next 2 or 3 years if we just say, when Ryan Day says something like that, if we don't scoff him out of the room because he's benefited from that, if we don't scoff people out of the room because they are, yes, benefiting from a broken system, but also exposing that broken system, we have to find a way to agree with, to not necessarily always agree with the coaches that and what they're saying, but at least give him more leeway to talk. At least give him the platform to talk and figure out kind of a pathway forward. Obviously, a lot of people are in favor of commissioners coming into the mix, maybe one, maybe multiple. Bottom line is there's a lot of different things that need to change about the sport, and Ryan Day's trying to change them. Ryan Day's doing his best with his voice to try to change some of the issues, and I get it. I get the frustration around him. I get the frustration around Ohio State bringing in all these guys. I get all of that. But the reality is we got to find a way forward without tampering being a part of this game. And if it is, it's let's be fair, it's totally going to be a part of this game going forward. One way or another, whether it's illegal or it's not, it's going to be a part of this game. Now, the best thing you can do is punish these guys as best you can and hope it slowly tapers out of the sport. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. It looks like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate will stay put at Ohio State, so no real worries in that respect, but this happens all over the sport, and some you hear about, some you don't. If they told you about all of them, then you would see tweets all down your scale. So that is going to be something that we're going to have to watch, and definitely something that I'll bring up tomorrow when I get into kind of if I was commissioner for a day type of a situation. But there's a couple of different things that need to be figured out there. A lot of them can't be figured out until the NCAA gets out of the way and someone new comes into the mix to lead college football the way it probably should be led. So a lot of different things there, and we'll definitely unpack them in more detail. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, let's take an early look at what the NFL draft looks like going into 2025, because there's a lot of really weird groups, if I'm being totally honest. You know, the quarterback group, not quite as strong as it used to be. The defenders are just littered with guys that I think are going to be Hall of Famers. It's going to be really fun to break this down, and we'll do kind of a 50,000 feet view right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the different things happening with tampering in the sport. Ohio State was kind of the center of this world when we talked about Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. A lot of it's going to have to be figured out, and frankly, I'll get back to this Anthony comment because I think it's absolutely fascinating and definitely something that we'll probably get in a little bit more detail later this week, but Roger Goodell getting involved, the NFL getting involved in this thing, I think all of us understand that we are heading towards a minor league football program. When you're talking about college football, it's already essentially that, but in a little bit more aggressive terms, it will be a minor league NFL product, and it's not the worst idea in the world for those two entities to work together. It's not. It would definitely help out scheduling and not have those crazy overlaps that you absolutely hate. It would make a lot of sense. And it's not necessarily my ideal way going forward, but as long as he has the right guys around him that know college football, you can make this happen very quickly, and you can make it happen in a very, very good respect. So that's definitely something to watch and something that I'll unpack tomorrow and maybe later in the week in a little bit more detail. But let's take an early look at this 2025 NFL draft. It's a weird one. I'll be totally honest with you guys. It's a very, very weird class we have sitting in front of us because not necessarily quarterback driven. It's not a class where you're going to be watching the quarterbacks every single time they go out on the field. Obviously, those will be the guys that will get a lot of press. There's no doubt about that. They always do. But there's tons of other guys. You know, you talk about Travis Hunter. You talk about Abdul Carter and Mason Graham and Will Johnson. There's going to be some special players that are taken in the top 10 that could be very, very interesting to watch going down the road. And Anthony, you bring in a rumor about Shedeur Sanders, and let's talk about those quarterbacks and see where they could possibly go. So you have the two guys up top, and these are Mel Kiper's rankings, not my rank. Oh, excuse me. I think I flipped those two. Shedeur Sanders should be number 1, Cam Ward number 2. Apologies for that. Kind of mix those two up right there. But overall, those two guys up top are the two guys up top. I don't know if there's really any question about that. Maybe there's some guys that could kind of knock them off their pedestal depending on the way that they look throughout the first couple of workouts. I'd be surprised if I'm being totally honest. I think those are the two guys that you're going to see. I think those are almost guaranteed first rounders. I think they will go in the first round. Anthony says there could be Shedeur falling out of the first 10. I'd be a little bit surprised if I'm being totally honest, but definitely will be something to watch, and we can get into that in a little bit more detail as we get to the teams that are picking in the top 10. But beyond that, you got Jackson Dart, you got Jalen Milroe, who I probably would rank a little bit lower, and we'll get into that later in the week. And then you got Kyle McCord, Will Howard, Quinn Ewers, Dylan Gabriel, Curtis Rourke, Tyler Shuck, and you also have Riley Leonard, not on this list, but right off it. So a very fun group, a group that is really hard to pin down in a lot of different respects. You have Shedeur Sanders and Travis Ward, two guys that I think are going to go in the first round. I cannot feel confident that they're going to be long-term NFL quarterbacks. Both are very, very talented, but both have the same issue that Caleb Williams had coming out, and neither of them have the outright athletic ability that Caleb Williams has. So that's going to be something to watch, and definitely something that could kind of impede them throughout the process. I've said a couple of times on here, I think there's going to be at least 2 or 3 other guys that go in the first round. You're more than welcome to try to figure out who those guys are, because I have no earthly idea. Now, I do think Jalen Milroe's catching enough juice in the kind of NFL world right now. We'll see what happens in those throwing drills in the combine, but definitely someone to watch here. I think Will Howard, someone that could find their way up into the first round, depending on the way that he goes throughout his process. And then Quinn Ewers, definitely a guy that has all the ability in the world, definitely has some issues that he has to figure out, but given the right system, Pete Carroll was just hired over at the Raiders. That could be a fit. That could work very, very nicely. I think the Rams could work very nicely, as well as the 49ers. So definitely some teams to watch around him. I don't know if he's a first rounder. I think he's an early second rounder, late first rounder, if I'm being totally honest, but not really sure where he's going to fall. Definitely a guy that will be all over the rankings as you get deeper. And then Dylan Gabriel, Curtis Rourke, Tyler Shuck, all going to be later round draft picks if I had to imagine, but all guys that I think could develop into some really good quarterbacks at the very next level. Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in a second, Anthony, what all these teams are going to do possibly. But overall, let's get into the top non-quarterback offensive players. I did include Travis Hunter over here. I just think he's going to play a little bit more wide receiver. I battle back and forth on that, if I'm being totally honest. I think it kind of depends on the team that he goes to, but I have a team in mind that I think he's going to go to, so we'll talk about that here in a second. And then Tedariah McMillan, incredible player, absolutely. Ashton Genty is going to be the number 1 running back off the board, and we'll talk about my running back rankings. I have probably a little bit different than a lot of people have out there in that respect. And then you do have Kelvin Banks, you have Will Campbell, you do have Josh Simmons, all elite offensive tackles, all guys that will go in the first round. Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren will go in the first round, absolutely. I really love what Colston Loveland could bring to a team. And then you do have Tyler Booker. Cannot say enough about Tyler Booker. I think he's one of my favorite guys going into this draft, and I think he's going to be a 15-year starter at guard for someone. Just an absolutely forceful guy that is going to make all types of big-time plays. And then Luther Burden's that guy that you just want to see succeed, if I'm being totally honest. I think there's a lot of talk around him and the Bengals with possibly T. Higgins walking out the door. Obviously, that will develop over time, but it's going to be awesome to watch this group unfold, and definitely a group that will probably dominate the first round a little bit more so than those quarterbacks would, at least in years past. The Curtis Rourke question from Anthony here is a fun one, because it's hard to define. There's a number of different places that I think he would work very nicely in. I think one to kind of watch kind of out of the corner of your eye is maybe Seattle. They just hired Clint Kubiak up there. I think when you have Geno Smith right in front of him, sort of a similar quarterback. Curtis Rourke might not be quite as, physically gifted as what Geno Smith is, but I do think it's a system where he takes 1 year, 2 years to figure that thing out and then hits the ground running. I think he could be a really fun player, no doubt about that. And Loveland, he reminds me of every elite defense or elite blocking tight end, and George Kittle is a great comp for him. I think he's one of those guys that is as polished of a route runner as you're going to find at that position in quite some time, if I'm being totally honest. If Brock Bowers didn't come out last year, we'd be talking about this guy a lot more as we head up to this thing. But going to be really interesting to watch all of that unfold. Obviously, a ton of things to really get into for the defensive side of the ball. Abdul Carter's number 1. He will likely be my number 1 prospect. He might not be my number 1 pick, but definitely will be my number 1 prospect. And then you got Mason Graham, you got Will Johnson from Michigan, elite players, and then you got the little bit of a Georgia run. You got Jalen Walker, Mykel Williams, and Malachi Starks, all guys that I expect to go in the first round. Nick Imamwari is definitely an interesting guy to watch, because you do have some guys beyond this list like say a Jade Barron or a couple of different guys that could possibly take that realm from him, but definitely a very talented guy. I'd expect him to go in the first round, but could change just a little bit over the next little bit. Jahad Campbell is a guy I love. I think he's going to be a 10-year NFL vet at linebacker. Cannot wait to see where he goes. Shamar Stewart's the guy that's really catching my eyes a little bit more as we go throughout this process. Definitely a guy that I think can be an immediate starter for wherever you need, really. And then Siobhan Revel Jr. is a guy you're going to want to watch from ECU, cornerback, very talented, very fast, very rangy. He's going to make a lot of plays and definitely be a guy that maybe won't be the first he won't be the first cornerback off the board. Very well could be the second or third. Will be awesome to see what he can do. You know what? That makes sense to me, if I'm being totally honest, Anthony. I think Mason Graham and Abdul Carter, two Hall of Famers, as far as I'm concerned. I look at those two guys play football. It's very hard to figure out a way where they are not going to dominate at the next level. So I'm all the way with you. I think both those guys are downright elite. I think you're splitting hairs when you talk about those two elite talents. One coming off the edge, one in the interior. It would be incredible to watch what would happen when it's not going to happen. In my dream, having those two guys on one defensive line would be incredible to watch. But overall, it's going to be awesome to see what happens here. And then it's a group that, or defensively, it's a group that I very much love, and there's so much talent on the back end. And then you get into the top 10 picks. You get Tennessee Titans going number 1 overall. I have to assume it's going to be one of the quarterbacks. Now, they did say they wouldn't pass over a generational talent. I think Travis Hunter fits that bill. Frankly, I think Abdul Carter kind of fits that bill as well. So I do think there's a lot, and Mason Graham might fit that bill if I'm being totally honest. So there's a couple of different guys that possibly could throw a curveball here. I expected to be the first quarterback off the board. Right now, it seems like Cam Ward might have the inside track there. For the Browns, if it's not Travis Hunter, he went number 1. That's really the only reality that I see here. If it's not Travis Hunter going to Cleveland at number 2, it means that he went number 1 to Tennessee, and I don't think there's any other reality, if I'm being totally honest. Now, the Browns need a quarterback. They don't have the money to go get a quarterback right now. So they're going to have to buy low somewhere in free agency, and they're just going to have to trust that they can figure it out in 2026. So I think it's going to be Travis Hunter, get that baseline, get that elite player, and then move from there. For the Giants, I think you see a lot of offensive tackles start to go right about now. Whether it's the Giants that they're going to take a quarterback, Once you get to the Patriots, you're going to get into some offensive tackle realm. You have Patriots, Jaguars, you have Saints, Bears, a couple other teams in there that absolutely could use some offensive tackle help. You'll see Kelvin Banks, Will Campbell, a lot of these guys, Josh Simmons, a lot of these guys start to go right around there, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. And maybe Tennessee does trade down. I do think there is an interesting reality where Tennessee's not quite as tied to the quarterback position as a lot of people seem to think around the NFL, and I don't necessarily think it's a slam dunk that they're going to take a quarterback. And if they're planning on taking Travis Hunter, not the worst idea in the world to trade down just a little bit, maybe give the Giants your pick, or maybe you might want to avoid the Browns altogether. So that's going to be kind of a precarious situation. But overall, I do think it's going to be one of those things where Titans probably have a little bit more leeway to not take a quarterback this time around, and it'll be interesting to see what they do in that respect, because that's going to be a battle one way or the other. But overall, the NFL draft's always a really fun thing for me. You get to blur the lines between college football and the NFL. You get to watch all of the players that you've just adored watching the last 4 years officially get their dream of having their name called on draft day. It's a really cool thing. There's no doubt about that. And it'll be awesome to see all of this unfold. We'll obviously get into a couple of more details throughout the week. I'll get into my quarterback rankings, into my, top 10, maybe top 15 picks, who knows. We'll go a little bit deeper possibly, but a lot of different things that are coming throughout the rest of this week. But you got some really interesting groups. There's no doubt about that. A quarterback class that is not necessarily all that incredible, at least on paper, and then Abdul Carter, Mason Graham, Will Johnson, all those guys that are just freaks of nature on the defensive side of the ball. And just for fun, you might have one of the most influential football players of our time, and Travis Hunter getting maybe drafted number 1 overall, maybe drafted a little bit later. And let me get to this Dolphins comment right here. Yes, I totally understand that. Yeah, Shamar Stewart's one of those guys that you look around the edge rushers in this class, a lot of ability all across the board. A lot of guys that are very fast, that have really good hands, that do a lot of really great things. Shamar Stewart's the guy that he's going to walk in day one and be ready to roll. And not necessarily just in pass rush, but in run coverage, in setting the edge in a lot of different ways. He is the most physical guy at the edge rushing position as far as I'm concerned, and wouldn't be surprised if they put a very physical guy next to a Chop Robinson type that is going to get around the edge and wreak havoc on the quarterback. It's going to be really fun to watch what they do with that pick, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it ended up being that guy across from Excuse me, apologies. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Shamar Stewart across from Chop Robinson next year. But it's going to be awesome to watch this unfold. You know, the NFL draft's always that time of the year where a lot of different things happen, and a lot of different teams have different rankings, and you're going to see some picks that you do not expect by any means, and maybe it'll come number one overall. Maybe Travis Hunter will go number one overall, and then every other quarterback ranking is thrown into whack. So it'll be really interesting to unfold that. I'll get into my top 10 quarterbacks, my top 10 defenders, a lot of different rankings throughout the weekend, maybe, just maybe, a little bit of a early mock draft on the first round. So we'll get into that, all of that throughout the week, but wanted to take a little 50,000 feet view of this, and then let's move on to a little teams to view, teams with the most to prove as we head into 2025. Definitely some big time teams, and one that we've already talked about a little bit, but we'll get into them right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just took a quick look at what the NFL draft is going to look like in April, I believe. Late April is when it unfolds, and definitely will be an awesome thing to watch. We'll get into it in a little bit more detail throughout the week, give some rankings and some possible mock drafts later in the week. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and let's talk about the teams with the most to prove going into 2025, because there's a whole lot of them. We'll probably get into a couple more tomorrow if I'm being totally honest, but let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's get into the very first team. We'll start with the team that we talked about to start the show. It is Penn State. I've already talked about it. I won't waste too much time here, but Penn State is the team. There's no two ways about that. They are the team that, if you were going to peg anyone with the title or bust moniker going into 2025, it would be the Penn State Nittany Lions. James Franklin has the best roster he's ever had. He has the best staff he's ever had. He has tons of veterans coming back to that defense and offense. He has top-line talent to compete with anyone in the country. Now it's time to win games. Now it's time to win those big games that have really, really messed with you. And it's not just win big game. You got to win big games. You can't just beat Ohio State, lose in the first round of the CFP, and call it a day. That's not good enough. Plain and simple. You can't just lose to LSU in the Cotton Bowl in the quarterfinals just to lose in the semifinals to Texas. That's not good enough. Plain and simple. And I think Penn State fans kind of understand that. Now, the question is, if they do get that, let's just say they beat Ohio State in the regular season, and then they get to the Big Ten title but lose, and then they find their way to the semifinal of the CFP but then lose to Texas. Are we asking the same questions? Is that enough to take that step forward for people to say, okay, it'll be a new quarterback, it'll be a lot of new things next year, but at the very least, we have the foundation to work around? Or are they going to be pissed off if they don't win a national title? That'll be something that only time will tell, and definitely will be a huge thing for James Franklin's future at Penn State. Michigan's another team that I think has a huge year ahead of them, plainly because you were the national title champion about 365 days ago, and now you got to regroup. Now you got to find a way to get back to the top, because 7-5 is just not remotely good enough, and you're losing a lot of guys. You're losing dudes all over the place on defense, 2 elite running backs, and incoming freshman quarterback being broken in. A lot of stuff going into this season for Michigan, and definitely some stuff that could very well get in the way. You know, Bryce Underwood's an elite talent in every respect of the word, but they are a team that you gave a couple of mistakes here or there. Maybe they can't play the catch-up game the way that they really need to. Now, I think they're going to be a good team. There's no doubt about that, but they're going to be a team that's going to be really interesting to watch, and if they don't bounce back in the way that they expect, if they don't get to, let's say, 9 wins, just as a current moniker, and we'll get into kind of the schedule a little bit here in a second, but overall, let's say they get to 9 wins. Is that good enough? I tend to believe that it is. I tend to believe that if you get to 9 wins, you can move forward to 2026, feel totally confident in where you are right now, but it's also one of those things where maybe if you get to 8 wins or 7 wins, and then you're looking up at the end of the year and you're thinking, is this just who we are now, at least for the next little bit? Is this just who we are regardless of who's under center? But it's definitely going to be something to watch. They do go to Norman in week 2. They go to Lincoln in week 4. But they avoid Penn State, Oregon, Illinois, and Indiana. This is a schedule that they should get at least 9 wins, likely 10 wins, if I'm being totally honest. And that changes the way that you have to prove a lot going into 2025, because the schedule is going to set up nicely for you you better be able to take advantage of it. And then this one. I don't think it has to be said too much more if I'm being totally honest, because the reality is Texas has been knocking on the doors the last couple of years. At a certain point, you got to kick it down. At a certain point, you got to break through and win that national title. And something we'll talk about probably later in the week is how coaches are just taking a little bit longer to get their national titles than they were before, even before the 14 playoff, even into the 14 playoff a little bit. So that's something I kind of want to unpack a little bit later in the week, because it is a very interesting thing when we talk about coaching expectations in 2024. But overall, it's another year where Sark has to prove that this program is not going anywhere. You know, the first year was a lot of overturn, but you had the quarterback, and you had a lot of the guys that were going to be important on the defensive side of the ball. Now it's about just finding a way to get that new quarterback in there, finding a way to get new playmakers in there, and find a way to get this program in a place where no one questions it going forward. No one questions if they're going to be able to reload, if they're going to take a little bit of a lull. It's just who Texas is, and that's going to start this year. If they get to 10 and 11 wins, get to the CFP, then it's been made very clear that that's just who they are, at least for the time being. Georgia's the other team here. They were not Georgia in 2024 by any means. They were not a good rushing football team, and that's something they've loved to do. They weren't great at pass protection. That's something they've been very good at. And they didn't have the tight ends involved, and that's something that's been a huge piece of this. So the biggest part of this, obviously, is wide receiver talent. It's something that has to be fixed, and Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas do a whole lot to fix that problem, and some of the incoming talent, I think, does as well. So I think they're going to be fine at that position. I don't necessarily worry too much about that position. I think this offense is going to be more dangerous next year, like it was when Stetson Bennett was running the show and tearing people to pieces. But overall, if Georgia wants to stay on top of the sport, it's going to be huge in 2025. You know, they fell just short the last 2 years. Got to step up in 2025. Got to at least assert your dominance on the top of the sport and not go out in the quarterfinals. Maybe go out in the semifinals or the final and find your way to the national championship once again. If they win it, that's 3 in 5 years, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a dynasty. So we'll talk about that in time. Obviously, definitely something to think about, but Georgia's done enough thus far to feel confident going into next year, but definitely some lingering questions that still lie. Miami's the other team here. You missed a huge chance in 2024. There's really no other way to put it. You had a bad defense, and that was the end-all be-all. It's the same thing that happened with LSU in 2023 was the offense was clicking. You had a Heisman winner at quarterback. You had all the guys that you wanted around him, and the defense just couldn't stop anything. They couldn't stop Molasses and Winter, and now you're looking forward and you're saying, you got a good team coming back. There's no doubt about that. Carson Beck coming into the mix is huge. The reality is the defense is the problem. One way or the other, Corey Heatherman is going to have to get that thing in order and get it in order pretty fast. Now, I think the talent level is more than fine. I think they're going to be totally fine when it comes to a talent perspective. They got to execute at a higher level, plain and simple. They have to be a little bit better on the back end, brought in some great guys that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later in the show and later in the week, honestly. I'll get into a couple of guys I'm watching, but overall, they've done their job thus far. There's no doubt about that. The reality is they should have been in the ACC title and playing for a CFP spot this year. They definitely should be next year, and if they're not, then the questions about Mario Cristobal get that little bit louder around Coral Gables. Clemson here. It's a team that I would put right behind Penn State when you come to the run-it-back category. Now, the difference here is not a lot of guys forgoed their NFL draft process to come back to Clemson, so maybe not run it back is the best respect, but the veteran talent that they do have is very, very clear. And the guys that maybe forgoed some of the NFL stuff to find their way back. I think when you look at what they've been able to do, the talent level is going to be at least relatively close to what it was in the 2018, 2016 type realm. And then the other piece is Dabo Swinney. I think he's done a great job kind of finding his way out of his comfort zone to this point. You know, hired two outside coordinators. When you talk about Tom Allen, we talk about Garrett Riley, two great hires that 5 years ago I don't think he makes. And then we talk about you went into the portal. He actually picked up some guys there. Didn't quite dip in as much as I wanted them to, but at the end of the day, did some very, very nice things. Brought in Will Help from Purdue and did some awesome things there. You just got to execute at a very high level. You know, everyone's coming in saying Clemson is the team to beat in the ACC. I think Miami's right there. I think a couple other teams are in that mix as well. But the reality is, this is the team. They have to find a way to get back on the top of the sport, find a way to win the ACC once again, get to the CFP, and hopefully be in a little bit better of a place in the CFP than they were this time around, having to go to Austin to play their first game. So it's a team that I think can win a national title. A lot of things have to come into place, and definitely some things that might be a little bit uncomfortable for Dabo to come into place, but the reality is if they can get this thing clicking pretty quickly and if they can get a little bit more out of that defense, you're going to have the offense to make some plays. I can absolutely promise you that. So Cade Klubnik's got to take steps forward. The defense has to take steps forward, and a lot of things have to change around there. But the reality is this is a team that is loaded to the gills with talent, and I would not shy away from picking them to win the national title. Alabama, we'll talk about them a little bit more tomorrow. We'll talk about Kalen DeBoer a little bit more tomorrow, but this is one that was just really hurt by elite quarterback play in 2024. Now you move forward to 2025, and the reality is Kalen DeBoer can't do another year like that. Now, I don't think he would necessarily be fired if they went 9-3 next year. I think people would have conversations. As crazy as that sounds, that's what the Alabama job is. He understood that when he took it, and it's obviously something that he's going to have to deal with going forward. It looks like it's going to be Ty Simpson at quarterback, but that kind of remains to be seen. That'll be a fascinating thing to watch throughout spring camp, and maybe we'll do a couple of storylines to watch, or quarterback battles to watch throughout spring here later in the week. But overall, this team's going to be very good in 2025. The talent level is absolutely ridiculous. The quarterback is the thing that needs to come into place more than anything else, and let's just say Alabama falls on their face and goes 8-4 next year. A lot of guys are finding their way out the door, including Ryan Williams and including a lot of the young talent you have on that team. That might be the end of the Kalen DeBoer era at Alabama. So he's got to be very careful going into next year. Obviously, has a tough schedule. They got to execute at a very high level. They got to get to the CFP at the very least next year. And if they can't, then it's going to be really, really awkward down there in Tuscaloosa. And then LSU. LSU had Miami's year that they just had in 2023. They had Jaden Daniels, they had Brian Robinson, they had Malik Neighbors, and they left it all on the table because their defense was that bad. They made the change at defensive coordinator, and they got better throughout 2024. Now they got to hit the road in 2025 and really get rolling. It's going to be an interesting team to watch. Another kind of run-it-back team with Garrett Nussmeier and a couple other guys foregoing the NFL draft to find their way back, and they got to roll, if I'm being totally honest. Brian Kelly's on thin ice right now. Garrett Nussmeier is a guy that everyone understands the talent level that he has, but is still waiting for it to all click at the right moment. They're a team that has to make it to the CFP. They're a team that has to make it to the CFP. They have to find a way to maybe win a game while they're there, and who knows, maybe make a little bit of a run in that thing. The reality is, it's not crazy to expect that from this team, from a team with a third-year starting quarterback, with a guy that can make all the throws in the world, with the talent on the outside, with upgrades all over the defense. They should be able to make this happen. There's some things that need to be figured out, no doubt about that, but the reality is LSU doesn't execute in 2025. Brian Kelly's looking for a new job, and LSU's scrambling for a new head coach. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. And we'll get into a couple other teams tomorrow, kind of go through some more teams with stuff to prove, because there's a whole lot of them, obviously. But let's take our fourth break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about the transfer portal. We'll get into the winners and the losers from the transfer portal in the winter cycle. Definitely some big-time winners, some huge losers throughout the sport. So we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the teams with the most to prove as we head into 2025. Obviously, did not get to all of those there, so probably we'll get into those a little bit more detail tomorrow. But let's jump into the transfer portal winners and losers. From this past winter cycle, there's a whole lot of winners. There were a lot of teams that really cleaned up on the portal trail, and we'll talk about them right here. So let's jump into this. A lot of different movement has already happened. A lot of guys, especially on the offensive side of the ball, I've found has been exorbitant amounts of movement, not so much on the defensive, but plenty of guys to talk about on both sides of the ball. And the first big-time winner is LSU. LSU has done an incredible job over the last couple of months, and it's been a lot of guys, but it's been a lot of guys in the positions that you badly need them in going into 2025. Because when you talk about this team, as you head into the next season, it was offensive line, it was wide receiver help, and it was DB help. Those were the things that you absolutely needed. No way, no how, or no negotiations around that. They got Barry and Brown, they got Nick Anderson, they got Destin Hill coming in at wide receiver, they got Michael Van Buren to back up Garrett Nussmeier, which might make him the best quarterback room in the entire country. Bauer Sharp and Donovan Green coming in at the tight end room are two very underrated groups that come into a loaded tight end room with Trydez Green as well in there. And then you got Thompson, you got Braylon Moore at offensive lineman. Did a really good job on the offensive side of the ball, filling all the gaps you needed. You know, you had 2 offensive tackles leave, you get Josh Thompson, you get Braylon Moore to help that out, and I think they're probably going to get a couple more guys if I'm being totally honest. You need some wide receivers. Barry and Brown, Nick Anderson, Destin Hill is about as good as you're possibly going to do, and then you had a backup quarterback that gives you stability in a lot of different respects, and you badly need it. And then on defense, probably the more important part of this side of the ball is Patrick Payton, Jack Pryburn, and Jamari Butler coming in on the pass rush. Patrick Payton, I think, is going to be a downright star in Blake Baker's offense or Blake Baker's defense. That's something that we'll definitely unpack. And then Mansour Deline, Jakeem Jackson, Tamarcus Coley on the back end. Just elite stuff. It's about as good as you can possibly imagine from this group right about now. They've done an incredible job, and it's been awesome to watch this unfold because this was always going to be the year. You know, you bring in Blake Baker last year. It was always going to take some time for that defense to really get in rhythm. Now you're ready to hit the ground running in 2025. You got to deliver, or you're going to be probably finding a new coaching staff around there pretty shortly. I don't know where they rank, Anthony. I think they're somewhere between 15 and 20, if I'm not mistaken. I can't exactly remember exactly where they sat, but they have a very solid class. I really like the guys they picked up, and actually, I'll do a segment next week talking about some under-the-radar guys that I've really liked the pickups from. I think they have a couple of those guys, if I'm being totally honest. So I'll get into them in a little bit more detail and give you that answer tomorrow for sure, but definitely something that they're doing more than fine in the portal, and they're doing the things that they very much need to do in the portal. Texas Tech is the other big-time winner that I wanted to talk. Oh, excuse me. I think I just skipped over my guys, Purdue. Purdue is a loser, excuse me. They lost guys like Jeffrey Emba. They lost Nyland Green, Max Clare, Will Helt, Dylan Tieneman. Ridiculous players. All of those guys are big-time players. Really, when you look back at that Purdue team, they had more talent. They had more talent than they knew to do with, apparently, because that should have been a better team. Just plain and simple. I get they were in the Big Ten, and I get the talent wasn't downright elite. There were too many guys on that team to be that bad. Just frankly, it was bad. So makes sense that they fired the head coach, and now you move forward with some very interesting problems as you move forward. If you're Barry Odom, he's been more than fine, at least keeping his head above water in this transfer portal process, but he definitely lost to more than he brought in. So going to be interesting to watch what happens there, and definitely a team that swimming uphill going into 2025. The winner is Texas Tech. They've done an incredible job, and this has been one of the more surprising things that we've seen throughout the first part of the portal, because I don't think anyone thought Texas Tech had the ability to turn up the heat to that level, and they very much did. They've done an incredible job, and it starts on the defensive side of the ball with Cole Wisniewski coming in, with you have Lee Hunter coming in, you have Romello Height coming in, but then on the offensive side of the ball, Hunter Zambrano, an Illinois State interior offensive lineman, a big-time player, Reggie Virgil, a great player from Miami of Ohio that went for over 1,000 yards last year, Quentin Joyner, a running back at USC that I just think is really special, if I'm being totally honest. And then you had another defender in Bryce Pollock. They've done an incredible job. They've really raised this team's floor. They've raised their ceiling, and they're giving them a shot. There's no doubt about that. They're giving them a shot to find a way to a Big 12 title, and I wouldn't necessarily count out the Red Raiders if I was talking right now. It's a very good group, and absolutely one that has gotten a whole lot better over the last couple of months. Oklahoma is a loser. It's been a very weird offseason for Oklahoma, so I don't want to bury them too much here because you got the quarterback. You got John Mateer, and I think you've done a number of really nice things throughout this portal cycle, but when you lose Nick Anderson, when you lose Jaleel Farouk, when you lose Bauer Sharp and Jaquez Hunter and Jackson Arnold and Dason McCullough, it's going to be a down. There's no doubt about that. There's going to be certain things that are going to have to come into place. Now, I do love some of the things that they did. I love the John Mateer addition, obviously. I love some of the things they did in the back end. I love being able to get Deion Burks to come back. So there's a lot of great things about this team. I tend to believe that they're going to have a little bit of a bounce back in 2025 and play some really good football. There's still some questions here and definitely some things that need to be figured out, but I think they've done not too bad in the portal. But when you watch all those wide receivers walk out the door, when that's your biggest issue going into 2025, hard to not put them in the loser category right about now. A winner is Oregon. They've done a great job throughout this portal cycle, and a lot of it has been across the offensive line. But we'll start with Micah Hughes, the running back from Tulane, about as good as you possibly could have done to replace Jordan James as far as I'm concerned. You got Malik Benson from FSU. Maybe one more wide receiver coming in there, but I could see Malik Benson being kind of that I'm blanking on the name right now, and I very much Trayshawn Holden. That's what I'm going for. Trayshawn Holden, he could kind of be that player for this team. And then on the offensive line, you get Isaiah World from Nevada, you get Alex Harkey from Texas State, you get Emmanuel Pregnon from USC. All great pieces that absolutely will almost absolutely be starters for you in 2025 and should be great pieces to this offense. There is the worry of a Nevada and a Texas State guy coming up to the Oregon level and being able to play right away. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that, but they've done a great job kind of filling the holes on this offense, at least as best they could. And then on defense, you get Bear Alexander, you get Taron Johnson, you get Dylan Tianneman, you get tons of guys that are going to make all types of plays for you on the back end and the front end. They've done a great job. There's no doubt about that. They've done a great job patching holes now with Dante Moore under center. You need that offensive line to be in order, and they got a kid that's I believe he's 6'6", 315, if I'm not mistaken, is Isaiah World. Terrifying individual, absolutely someone that will have an effect for Oregon this year. USC is a big-time loser, and it's one that I think they found their footing, kind of like Oklahoma. They found their footing pretty quickly overall, but I do think there are certain things that you just can't avoid. Losing Bear Alexander, losing Zachariah Branch, losing Deuce Robinson, Kyron Hudson, Quentin Joyner, and Miller Moss. It hurts. There's no way around that. But Miller Moss is a little bit different because a lot of people expected that one. But overall, you lost a ton of guys that are somewhat irreplaceable in a lot of respects. You're not going to replace a Zachariah Branch. You're not going to replace a Deuce Robinson. You're not going to get a Quentin Joyner in this cycle. They've done a good job kind of steadying the ship. You get Prince Trisham from Boise State. You get Jamal Jarrett from UGA. You get Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky. They've done enough, at least as of right now. They're going to have to do way more in spring. And as of right now, if you look at what 2025 holds, Lincoln Riley could be in the crosshairs, and if they don't deliver very, very quickly, and this portal class has a lot to do with that, they're going to be in a really bad spot in 2025. Oh, that's a good point, Anthony. The portal is kind of a confusing entity, right? There's so many people that I could say, Ohio State's a winner for keeping Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate in there. I could see Texas as a winner because a lot of people came out after their young talent over the last little bit, but it's definitely something to talk about. Yeah, Miami absolutely has done a great job getting the guys they need. They haven't necessarily gone crazy like they kind of have in a couple of past years. I don't think they feel the need to. I think they really think that we get the quality guys in here, the right guys in the right positions, our team's going to take care of the rest of it. So that's definitely a team I want to look into a little bit more detail with their transfer portal because it was a really, really fun group they put together. So maybe I'll do this again. Maybe I'll do one more winners and losers around the block later in the week, but definitely a group that has done a great job just getting the right guys. Not necessarily all the guys in the world, but getting the guys that really fit what they need and fitting their culture very well. And then you do have Auburn. Auburn's in a spot where 2025 is huge for them, and it kind of hurts that you have a lot of other teams in your conference that are doing that as well, especially your rival in Georgia and Alabama. But you move forward. You add Eric Singleton. You add Horatio Fields. You add Jackson Arnold to that offense. Absolutely can be a dangerous offense in 2025. I do think the loss of Jarquise Hunter is going to be a very big deal, if I'm being totally honest, but definitely something that's going to be huge for them and at least elevate that offense a little bit. Then on the offensive line, you get Xavier Chaplin, you get Mason Murphy, absolutely will help there. And then defensively, you get Dallas Walker from Western Kentucky, very talented edge rusher. You get Tay Seymour from Georgia Tech, tons of talent returning. I think it's going to be a much improved group. I still have some very big worries around Hugh Freeze and his ability to almost get picks by himself. I don't know how he does it, but at the end of the day, it's a team that I'm very wary about, but they've done a great job in the portal cycle thus far, and they've done a great job kind of filling the gaps they very much needed. At the end of the day, it comes down to that quarterback. Can Jackson Arnold hit the way that they need him to? And if he doesn't, it's going to get really ugly over there in Auburn, and Hugh Freeze will be at the very center of that. So that's definitely something to watch. Some of these are great groups that could lead to seasons that might have too aggressive expectations in some respects. You have some groups that are losers right now, but could really turn a corner depending on the way things fall into place over the next little bit. So that's how I see it from the winter portal cycle. Maybe we'll get into a little bit more of this throughout the week, but overall, we'll start looking forward to that spring portal cycle because it's going to be wild if you had to imagine. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We got great people covering every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports you need, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. Before I do get out of here, I do want to let you guys know that this will be my last week covering the GSMC College Football Podcast. It's been absolutely awesome to cover it for you guys, and obviously been awesome to interact with a lot of you guys throughout this process. I will be here throughout the rest of the week. I will be back here tomorrow, all the way throughout Friday, but Friday will be my last show around here. So apologies. I hate to kind of drop that bomb on you, but wanted to make sure I didn't drop it 5 minutes before the last show ended. So figured I'd do it early in the week. We'll talk about it more on Friday, but very much appreciate everyone watching. I will be back here tomorrow for my fourth to last show, I suppose. So I'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Let's go.